are continuing with our Atlas Shrugged series with the psychology of the characters in Atlas Shrugged. And today we have the enormous pleasure of turning to a very amazing man who is Ellis Wyatt. And a little bit about, but before we do it, I am going to turn to Andy for the disclaimer.
Well, I know I've made it in the world when I became a disclaimer guy for the Atlas Shrugged series, but Atlas Shrugged's a mystery, everybody. If you haven't read the book, there's going to be spoilers here, and you don't want to have the ending spoiled for you. So read the book first and then come back to this series. This series is timeless, it's immortal, and it'll be here forever. So take your time with that. Read the book first. That's the takeaway here.
Right. There are mysteries all the way through, and we could ruin all of them for you. We don't want to do that. So,
well, you did a good job as the disclaimer lady there, Ellen.
Okay. So let's turn to Ellis now. Ellis Wyatt, the way I would describe him is he has a fiery personality, which is really apt because we talk about his oil fields, Wyatt Oil, and we'll talk a little bit more about fire coming up. He is a man of action and passion. He holds his values passionately, just like all of Ayn Rand's heroes. But Ellis stands out as a person who is a trailblazer, a path maker. We see him in action. We see both his fiery side, his angry side, and we see his gentle side. So a little bit about Ellis's history. His dad had some oil fields that he was able to get a little bit of a living from, but Ellis took over and Ellis made them explode. He was able to find oil in so-called exhausted fields. With one man's effort, one man, Ellis Wyatt, in 8 years, new towns grew in Colorado. People were employed. It became a new, if not the industrial state in the country. And he was shipping his oil on Taggart Transcontinental. And of course, with Eddie in charge, a bunch of tank cars went over an embankment and exploded in fire, which did not please Ellis Wyatt. Ellis Wyatt, after that tragic loss of his tank cars, decides to ship with the Phoenix Durango, a little railroad. The Phoenix Durango just becomes wildly successful with Ellis Wyatt. And so James Taggart, pulling his political strings, passes an anti-dog eat dog law. And Ellis is fuming. He is so angry. So we meet Ellis coming into Dagny's office, and he gives her an ultimatum that in 9 months, she damn well better have those tracks up and running. The tracks that he needs, her train, the Rio Norte line, has to be in perfect working order in 9 months. Here's his ultimatum. It is now in your power to destroy me. I may have to go, but if I go, I'll make sure that I take the rest of you along with me. So you get this very feisty, passionate valuer, a trailblazer, a man of action. And with that, I will pass it over to Shoshana to talk about Ellis.
Okay, well, thanks, Ellen, for introducing us to the background and the context of Ellis Wyatt. He is one of the best characters in the novel, including the major characters, because everything about him is focused on his work and on his promoting his work, and on the way that he views his project of promoting his work before he learns about the strike and then afterwards. Now, the scene that you described is, of course, wonderful because in the novel, we hear about him and we know about him and we know about him as an achiever. And then we see him in the flesh, and he not only, matches his introduction, you could say, in the sense of he seems to be driven in a good way and committed and focused and so on, but also he is as expert in explaining what needs to happen as he is in figuring out, what to do with the oil and being innovative in that area. Part of what I just love about Ellis Wyatt is that right from the beginning, even before we meet him, we know that James Taggart doesn't like him, and that is absolutely a good sign. Okay, anyone James Taggart doesn't like, for example, Dagny, Reardon, why do we have to do business with Reardon? Because he always sends us what we need. And he doesn't like Ellis Wyatt, and Eddie Willers does like Ellis Wyatt. So, we have some sense of where he fits into our framework of characters in the novel. And now he shows up and he is unstoppable. Okay, he's unstoppable in getting into Dagny's office. He's unstoppable in saying what he has to say. And even we're told that Dagny is so appreciative of meeting a man like that, but she doesn't try to apologize. She doesn't try to explain. She simply assures him that he will get the transportation he needs. He reacts to that as, okay, it's not what he was expecting. And there we have, the introduction of the character and of the scene. Now, I actually vividly remember when I first read the novel, I thought that he was going to be someone else in the novel who was involved with Dagny. Just saying. Okay, because Ayn Rand likes in her novels to have opposition between characters who later end up being romantically attracted. And here he shows up and he's talking like an enemy, except he's not really an enemy if you really understand, and if he understands who Dagny is. So I thought that was just a great introduction to the character. He's direct, he's clear, and he's not playing patty cake. And he did what he had to do, and now what he has to do is to make Taggart Transcontinental deliver, since I have to do business with you people now because of James Taggart's shenanigans and the dog-eat-dog agreement. And well, incidentally, by the way, we've not been talking about the Atlas Shrugged movies, but which I've seen many times and I have many things to say about, but there's one touch in that first movie in the introduction of Ellis Wyatt that really grated in the script. And that's that he explains that he objects to the fact that what they did is that they ruined his best friend, Dan Conway, with the dog-eat-dog thing. And Ellis Wyatt is not concerned about what happened with the Phoenix Triangle because Dan Conway is his best friend. It's because you're not supposed to have dog-eat-dog provisions and he needs the railroad. And so you're putting it on that personal basis. That's not Ellis Wyatt, and Ellis Wyatt certainly wouldn't bring that up in his conversation with Dagny. He's very, very focused. So I love the introduction. And then of course, we've got the second act when he says, hello, Dagny, when she's out there visiting the line. And we're told that, that communicates everything. Right. And again, that's Ellis Wyatt. He doesn't need to make a big speech. And Dagny doesn't need to make a big speech. They both understand. Yeah. And of course, it's a gesture of friendship. Within the novel, that's when after Reardon and Francisco had a misunderstanding because when Reardon realized that Francisco let the copper go down with the ships and the slap and all that stuff, and then they reform their friendship, and they do it by exchanging names. And so hello, Dagny is, we're friends now, we're on the same side. And he, even without making the point, admits that he was the one who helped get things going again, and that Ben Neely wasn't in fact as good a man as Dagny had thought he was. And so, it's part of that whole effort in the first part of the book, and he is part of it. I mean, you've got Dagny doing her part, you've got Reardon doing his part, you've got Eddie Willers doing his part, because he's got to be the official Dagny while Dagny is out doing the John Galt line, and he's part of that too. And that's why at the end of the section, they all celebrate together. And it's just beautifully described. He's described as being young and joyous and happy. And that's absolutely coherent with the grimness and the driven quality that we had at the beginning. Exactly. I mean, he's very, very much someone you could imagine being one of the main characters. Yeah. And another novelist, maybe even, Ayn Rand, could write a whole novel about the story of Ellis Wyatt, because it's a very interesting story. And as you say, he's fiery, and that ties in with fire, and, fire as a symbol, and in, and the torch, which is mentioned later, Prometheus, he's he's in a good industry, and he's and it has symbolic power that fits his character and his way of proceeding. So I basically just sort of taking it to the end. He is so happy. He's arranged for his two friends,
Right.
to celebrate with him, and he just can't talk fast enough about how wonderful it is. And then he breaks the glass, and
Yeah,
you
we'll
know,
get there. We will
yeah,
get
may it all last. So I love his exuberance. I love his talent. I love the way that his happiness and his grimness go together.
Right. And just saying, as a description, he's 33 years old. He's described as having a violent temper, arrogant, but the arrogance has this sense of self-control. So Andy, you want to
Yes.
jump in?
Yeah, I think we should say something, about Dan Conway, who's an
Sure.
important player here, and Shoshana, you brought him up. Uh, since Dan Conway, had the Phoenix Durango and was enormously productive, and Ellis Wyatt was able to rely on Dan Conway for transportation. When he comes into Dagny's office, of course, Dagny is Taggart Transcontinental right now. She has to take the beating. She can't tell him, yo, Mr. Wyatt, that's my brother. Jim Taggart did that. I'm with you. She's got to take the beating and then just assure him, like you said, Shoshana, that he'll have the transportation that he requires. Dagny, of course, empathizes with him. She knows he's been wronged. They're producers and they respect each other. And even though they're competitors. And she says to him, you should fight this. This law is irrational. It's unjust. You should fight this. And Dan Conway says something to the effect that no, if we have to, a civilized society requires, the rule of the majority, and I have to go along with it if everybody just disobeyed or broke every law that they considered unjust, then we wouldn't have civilization. And I think Ayn Rand is making a commentary here on the plight of Socrates, because Ayn Rand knows the history of philosophy, and she knows that in the Crito, Plato shows us Socrates accepting the will of the majority, even though it's unjust. It's very likely that Socrates could have escaped. Certainly, in real life, certainly his students believe he can, because he had made rich and powerful friends as well as rich and powerful enemies. But he refused to, because society requires law. It was his thinking, and if this is what the law says, then we have to go along with it, even though it's unjust, and even though they're going to execute me unjustly. And I think Ayn Rand showing us in the character of Dan Conway, I think in the character of Dagny Taggart, she's showing us what she thinks is morally right, that we don't accept unjust laws, especially when they're going to result in the formal term would be execution. Is actually murder, read Socrates, because he did nothing to warrant any kind of criminal punishment, never mind execution. What proper rebels do is they stand up to unjust laws, like the American founders did. And so Dan Conway's an interesting character here in that, he's a producer, he's an honest man, he's a hero. We side with him, we empathize with him, but at the same time, he's making a mistake. He should not go along with the Phoenix Durango. Dagny's right about this. And just like Socrates' students were right, that he should have escaped and lived to fight another day. But I think Ayn Rand's showing us here the plight of an unjust hero who sanctions his victimizers.
Perfect. Yeah, and also Dagny makes the point with him, deep down, how do you really believe that they are right? And he says no. So you get that closure, that he grasped that it's wrong, but he's got the contradiction, as you say. He needs to follow the law, and the law means he needs to be murdered, as you say. So back to Ellis, if that's okay, unless you want to jump in with Dan.
I'm glad that Andy brought Dan Conway up, because I think he makes a really good foil to Ellis Wyatt. Ellis Wyatt, he wouldn't sit still for anything like that.
No,
and he doesn't.
No.
I would like to go back to a description of him. This is what you were bringing up, this scene, Shoshana, Dagny building the John Galt line. She's at the track now. She heard sharp, hurried footsteps and turned. A man was coming up the track. He was tall and young. His head of black hair was hatless in the cold wind. He wore a workman's leather jacket, but he did not look like a workman. There was too imperious and insurance in the way he walked. She could not recognize the face until he came closer. It was Ellis Wyatt. She had not seen him since that one interview in her office. So he goes from being this person who is just fiery. He's so angry with her. You can see his violent temper. I'm giving you the ultimatum. And now he says to her, "Hello, Dagny." In a single shock of emotion, she knew everything the two words were intended to tell her. It was forgiveness, understanding, acknowledgement. It was a salute. She laughed like a child in happiness that things should be as right as that. "Hello," she said, extending her hand. His hand held hers an instant longer than a greeting required. It was their signature under a score settled and understood. So just that wonderful, Ayn Rand gives us the visuals of this passionate character. Then I have one other scene, and then I'll turn it to you, Shoshana, this is one that I just love. This is when at the first run of the John Galt line, when Dagny's seeing movement and all of a sudden everything stands still on the train. She's on the train with Reardon, and she sees the sign of Wyatt Junction. The sign didn't move. That meant they had stopped. And the door opened. She knows she's the first to leave the train. And it said, for a flash of an instant, she felt the slenderness of her own body, the lightness of standing full figure in a current of open air. She gripped the metal bars and started down the ladder. She was halfway down when she felt the palms of a man's hand slammed tight against her ribs and waistline. She was torn off the steps, swung through the air, and deposited on the ground. She could not believe that the young boy laughing in her face was Ellis Wyatt. The tense, scornful face she remembered now had the purity of eagerness, the joyful benevolence of a child in the kind of world for which he had been intended. And so you see that Ellis has a contradiction that it's not a contradiction, it's reality. It's the malevolent universe premise that you have to stay away from people. He doesn't have people come to his house. He doesn't want any oratory after the John Galt line. He wants to do his work, as you've said, Shoshana. And the contradiction is he's got this benevolent universe premise where he just wants that unobstructed future where he can succeed and where Dagny can succeed, Reardon can succeed. He even talks about it being the Reardon Metal Age. He is just so joyous, and you see that conflict come out when they're having dinner at night privately. They don't go to any of the banquets. They don't want any. Dagny says, God, no, he protects them from it. They all go to Ellis's home for dinner. And after dinner, that's when the scene that, I don't know if you want to take that up, but that's when I'll just mention it. He throws the glass, and you can elaborate. And Reardon had said earlier, I've always wanted to see what you're like. And Ellis said, I've never had a chance to be what I'm like except tonight. And then he realizes that he doesn't know if this is going to last, this wonderful, boyish, joyous feeling. And he throws the glass as a replacement for his pain. His violence is symbolizing his pain that he's feeling inside, because he doesn't think that they will win in the world. So Shoshana, you want to take it from there?
Okay. Well, for one thing, I love the passage that you read in which she sees Ellis Wyatt and he's so happy. And of course, I'm sure everybody noticed that in the scene that we looked at just a minute ago, where he says, hello, Dagny, she laughs like a child, and now he's the child. And being a child is a good thing. Okay. In this novel, the kids are not brats. We've got those two nice kids in the valley. And we have, of course, our own characters, you know, Dagny and Francisco and Eddie when they were children, and how they're described for us, and the energy, the curiosity, the happiness, the expectation, the looking toward the future, as if the future is a good thing that we're going to live up to and live into. And here it's as if he's got a chance to be a child again and to be growing up into a world where he's happy. And he even thinks of it that way. You know, now I have a chance to be who I actually am. And I think it connects the idea of having that spirit with there being a certain kind of world, and that being happy is not a matter of, should not have to be a matter of us versus them, or, you know, myself against the world, which you might remember that was a Frank Lloyd Wright motto, which
Right.
stands for courage, but it also stands for a kind of opposition. And here it's, you know, it's our world and we're happy in it, which of course is the way, as he puts it, to the world as it seems to be right now, an acknowledgement that this is a moment, not necessarily, well, if it's the prelude to a future, that's great, the age of Reard and Metal. And if it isn't, it's a tragedy that this spirit and this is going to be lost and this smile is going to be wiped out. Now, in a way, it's one of the reasons I love this character, is that he's a perfect expression of the very issue that Dagny confronts throughout, is can she keep being Dagny and running Taggart Continental the way things are going? Okay. Or is the way things are going because of the corrupt moral code, is that going to make it impossible for her to do her work according to her values? Now, Ellis Wyatt's journey is, you might say, quicker, because you know, he comes to the point of, oh yes, this is the way it's supposed to be. And well, by the end of part 1 of the novel, the regulations have come down against Colorado, and he's had his visit, you know, from someone who's going to explain it all to him. And the short, happy life of Ellis Wyatt, living the way that he wanted to in what he later comes to call hell. Okay, so I think that what you have with Ellis Wyatt's story is that those, the prelude telling you who he is, what he's doing, the scene with Dagny where she seems to be the enemy, the scene with Dagny in which now they're allied, this scene in which they really seem to have won, but well, it's the John Galt line.
Right.
And within the novel, the John Galt line stands for an achievement, and it also stands for something that can be taken away and that makes your life harder because of the corrupt moral code, and he's going to get an education in that. And that's why he really does encapsulate so many of the themes of the novel, and we're going to see that later when we look at him in the valley. But I love that whole sequence of his being so happy and exuberant. The fact that he doesn't like to have other people around, well, as he says, he does have the guest rooms for the kind of people he likes, and he's got the 2 of them there, and he's just bubbling over and happy about that, and you know, and talking and celebrating and being glad. And breaking the glass, though, is the acknowledgement that what they've won here isn't everything. And there's a sense of, it seems that they've won, but within the world of Atlas Shrugged, the enemies against them have not learned their lesson and have not gone away. And as a matter of fact, part of what I think he might have been able to predict, and we see, is that the victory of the John Galt line invigorates the enemies of, now they've really got to take down the heroes. Right. You know, it puts Colorado at the center of the target, and we've got to take, you know, and so there he is. He's got destroy me printed on his forehead for the looters to see, because he's got something worth looting, and he represents power, you know, a certain kind of power, and that's what they want to have. The bad guys, you know, want to deprive him of, want to deprive the world of.
Right. Andy?
Yeah, there's a couple of points I wanted to make. When Ellis Wyatt smashes the glass there and shocks Dagny, because the anger seems to her inappropriate, you know, at a celebration, and yet Ellis Wyatt, unfortunately, Ellis Wyatt is right. Yeah. He's right about this, the state of the world, about the, you know, looches and the mooters, as I like to call them, the mooches and the looters, that they are, like Shoshana was saying, they are at ever-present danger. And he's right that they are now in the crosshairs, like you said, and they're gonna feel the full power of the soon-to-be communist state bearing down on them and destroying this achievement. So it turns out that his anger here is appropriate. He's right. And another point I wanted to make about Ellis Wyatt, going back to our discussion of before, that Shoshana, you said, accurately, that Ellis Wyatt would not take something like the anti-dog eat dog law sitting down. He wouldn't sit still for it. He'd fight. And he's more like, if Dan Conway's like Socrates historically, Ellis Wyatt's more like Patrick Henry. He's fiery, give me liberty or give me death, and I'm going to fight you guys to the death on this. He's more like the American founders. These laws are unjust, and we're gonna fight them. And so Ellis Wyatt has, in that tempestuous way, I think we should point out his anger is at the sight of injustice, especially when perpetrated against him. And in that way, like Ragnar, his righteous rage stands for justice. And it's unfortunately, in the world of Atlas Shrugged, he's got all too many opportunities to exercise his sense of moral outrage. So he's the great oil man. We should point out he's the one who developed the innovative method to extract oil from shale, which in the 1950s, when Ayn Rand was writing this, we knew was possible. In fact, I think it was doable back then, but it's just the process was so expensive. It was cost prohibitive. But he's the one who figures out how to extract oil from shale inexpensively to make it commercially viable. So he's a real innovator in the field of industry, like many of the great industrialists historically in the United States and elsewhere. But it's if you know the history of American industry, and Ayn Rand certainly did, John D. Rockefeller was the genius oil producer. And he makes a nice contrast with Ellis Wyatt, because Rockefeller was a devout Baptist, and he was he was a very, very religious guy, and he was very humble. Even when he retired, I think in the early 20th century, he was worth, I don't remember how much, $1 billion, $2 billion. But the interesting thing is Rockefeller's wealth 100 years ago had the purchasing power of over $400 billion today. So he had twice the wealth of Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos. He's probably the wealthiest man of history. But he was a very quiet, sedate a guy. In fact, they tell a story about Rockefeller, so talking about different from Ellis Wyatt, that he had some exercise equipment in the room in the office, and one of his junior executives who just started working there, didn't know who he was, told him, "Is this yours? Get it out of here." He's telling this to Rockefeller, the head of the company. And the young guy said, "We could use this space for such and such." And Rockefeller realized he was right. So he moved, didn't say anything. He just moved the exercise equipment. Later on, this young guy said, that was Mr. Rockefeller. He had to go apologize to him. And Rockefeller evidently was very cordial and respectful. But the guy who in real life really was like Ellis Wyatt was Cornelius Vanderbilt, the first great railroad man. He was fiery, he was tempestuous, he cussed like a longshoreman. He was vulgar and profane, and he'd cuss at people in business meetings. And I don't know that Ayn Rand doesn't depict Ellis Wyatt being cursing or anything, but he does have that same kind of fiery personality that Vanderbilt had. Vanderbilt wouldn't stand for any incompetence. Just one historic point I think that the viewers will find interesting. There's a story they tell about Vanderbilt, as he was an elderly man by this time, but he was an enormously productive railroad man, negotiating with Rockefeller, who was a young guy, and he's the great shipper of oil. And Rockefeller demanded a rebate, a break on the price. And they say Vanderbilt thundered and he yelled and he cussed at him, and Rockefeller, the devout Baptist who never cursed ever, just sat there calmly, while Vanderbilt was thundering in rage at Rockefeller's demands for a break in the price. And Rockefeller said at the end, he said, very calmly, he said, "Nevertheless, that's how it's going to be." You know, so it's a nice contrast with
Yeah.
Rockefeller, the oil man, very different than Ellis Wyatt, the oil man. Vanderbilt, the railroad guy, who was very similar to Ellis Wyatt, at least in the tempestuous outrage part of his character.
Yeah, so
Yeah, I think it's interesting that you mentioned Patrick Henry and the temperament, because I think that is true, that Ellis Wyatt with the temper, stands out in a way that's different from some of the other characters, and yet it's warranted. It's warranted why he has that temper, and it's almost as if, of course, there's a Patrick Henry theme, you could say. The school is called Patrick Henry, right? Patrick Henry University.
Right.
And Reardon at his trial speech, right? He says, I refuse to apologize for my success. I refuse to apologize for my ability. I refuse to apologize for my money. If this is evil, make the most of it. Like Patrick Henry, if this is treason, make the most of it. So it's as if that's kind of an underlying network of references. And he's the one who's got, Ellis Wyatt is the one who's got the temperament there.
And by the way, yeah, I'm sorry, Shoshana.
No, so it's okay, but I think that's interesting because sometimes you might have the idea that the heroes are all the same. No, they're not all the same.
No, they're not. They're not. And just go back to history for a second. I should add that Rockefeller Vanderbilt story. It may be apocryphal. I wasn't able to track, when I was writing the Capitalist Manifesto, I wasn't able to track down the source of it. Maybe a legend, but even if it is a legend, it fits their characters. If they had that kind of negotiation, that's probably how it would have went. So it's, somebody once said, I can't remember who it was, said, if this story ain't true, it ought to be. So I think that's applicable here.
So it shows their character. So,
yeah, it does.
So what I love about what Ellis shows us psychologically is he goes from saying, this is the first time I've ever been able, that when he's with Dagny and Reardon at his home after the first run of the John Galt line, and they're celebrating. And Reardon says, I've always been curious to know what you're like. And he says, I've never had a chance to be what I'm like except for tonight. That idea of, are we all what we'd like to be, or are we struggling? He doesn't have the consistency, because the consistency doesn't exist in reality between the malevolent universe premises and the benevolent ones. But he's got that anger, and that anger that, Andy, you've been talking about, in Shoshana, when they pass a special tax on Colorado to kill Colorado and to pay for the directives of all things, that tax is to pay for his own destroyers. Dagny remembers what Ellis had said, if I have to go, I'll make sure I take the rest of you along with me. And she remembers his violence. She remembers those two incidents. And she says, I have to reach Ellis to stop him. So you see Dagny going into a phone booth, holding her train, saying, Ellis, don't. And this is, I didn't realize this is only the second run of the John Galt line. And Dagny gets on that train. And at the end, instead of being lifted up and joyously embraced by Ellis and celebrated, she sees that they stop at it. They don't go all the way to Wyatt Junction, and she sees the fire, and she learns about the sign. I am leaving it as I found it. Take over, it's yours. That's how Ellis left. So Dagny's pretty sure that there is a destroyer in the world at this point, but you can see that he reached his breaking point. That's when Dagny starts to see the pattern. This isn't accidental. This is planned. And we will talk about the man in the cafeteria another time, not now. But
the man with a plan.
Yeah, the man with a plan. Yeah.
Well, I'm really glad you mentioned when he disappears, take over, it's yours, because that's it's a classic example of what the strike is throughout, and it's been hinted at. I mean, it's actually even there in the scene we discussed a while ago when Francisco tells Reardon at the anniversary party what he's thinking, you're thinking that without you, these people would be out there in the cold.
Yes, yes.
Yes. Okay. Well, that's sort of what Ellis Wyatt says. Okay, folks, you're out there in the cold now. I'm not making, no more oil for you. And then we see it in the State Science Institute when Stadler is complaining about that. And there's a line, it's a paragraph in Galt's speech about this, about what it would be like for the world without the creators. So Ellis Wyatt he doesn't have as much, so to speak, screen time as some of the other characters, but everything is to that purpose, in addition to showing what it means to someone from the inside to be that kind of achiever and to be killed. They're going to kill Colorado in the way that he is.
With
And
his
they,
mother.
they, they're able to put out the fire. He sets the oil fields ablaze. They're able to put out the fire, but there's that one, inextinguishable flicker of flame that comes to be known as Wyatt's torch, which has symbolic significance later on in the story, in the Taggart Tunnel disaster.
Yes.
But Wyatt's torch stands for something here. Ayn Rand uses symbols very effectively. It's not her main means of communicating ideas, but she's expert at it. And Wyatt's torch, which cannot be extinguished, it cannot be put out. It's symbolic not only of Ellis Wyatt's spirit himself, but of the great untamable free spirits who independent thinkers who carry us forward in the world, and their spirit. You could kill them, but you can't extinguish their spirit. And the great free thinkers, of course, go on. Ellis Wyatt himself goes on in the valley when he's on strike, and we'll come back to the world when Galt gives when the socialist system, the communist system outside has collapsed, and Wyatt will come back and revivify the oil fields. But that great free spirit cannot be quenched. You have to kill a person like that. You'll never, while they're alive, you'll never stop them. You'll never silence them. You'll never convince them that what they see with their own eyes and understand with their own brains is false. They'll never accept the dictates of a statist regime. They're way too independent for that, and that spirit can never be stifled. And I think the Wyatt's torch symbolizes that in the novel brilliantly.
Yeah, and it's a giving of a natural explanation for the parallel literary symbol of the burning bush in the Bible, which is a miracle, right? The bush that burns and that is not that the bush is not consumed, and then that's the introduction to this in Exodus, right? To the story of Moses leading the slaves out of the land of bondage, which you could say is what we're having here, that John Galt takes people out of bondage into a place of freedom, except that it's not a supernatural miracle. It's a natural miracle, that kind.
So just to jump on.
So yeah, I love that as a symbol.
Yeah, Andy, Ayn Rand actually ends with Wyatt's torch, right near the end of Atlas. I'll read the paragraph. It says, "But far in the distance, on the edge of the earth," this is from the valley now, "a small flame was waving in the wind, the defiantly stubborn flame of Wyatt's torch, twisting, being torn and regaining its hold, not to be uprooted or extinguished. It seemed to be calling and waiting for the words of John Galt was now to pronounce. The road is clear," said Galt. "We're going back to the world," and the sign of the dollar. So you are exactly right. She uses that imagery all the way to the end, that Wyatt's torch, that fire, that passion, that Wyatt wins in the end.
With those great untamable free spirits that will never be silenced.
They'll never be silenced. So
they'll never be or suppressed. You could kill any number of them, but Ayn Rand showing us the human spirit will be reborn, just like equality in Anthem. After we don't know how long, of a communist, fascist, totalitarian state, equality discovers the, the unspeakable word of I, and he remembers, he bonds with the saint of the pyre, and all those great free thinkers of the past. How did, what it must have been like for them when the totalitarians took over, and they couldn't act freely anymore. And he's empathizing with them across the centuries. And I think Ayn Rand's showing us this is the fate ultimately of dictators and totalitarians. They're going to be defeated because these free spirits will keep being born, and they won't be tamed.
Right. So
and ultimately they'll win, just like at the end of Atlas Shrugged.
Before we move into the Valley, I do want us to move into the Valley. But before we do, there were two other points that really illustrate that he is a man of action. So this is when they're building the John Galt line, and the scene that we described earlier, where he's meeting Dagny, and they have that wonderful handshake. So he tells Dagny, this is how he greets her after the handshake. Tell Nearly to put up new snow fences for 1.5 miles on the Granada Pass. The old ones are rotted. They won't stand through another storm. Send him a rotary plow. What he's got is a piece of junk that wouldn't sweep a backyard. The big snows are coming any day now. She said, how often have you been doing this? Coming and taking over from Nearly's place and coming to watch the work. He goes, every now and then when I have time. And she said, were you here when they had the big rock slide? He said, yes. She said, I was surprised at how quickly they cleared the track when I got the reports. It made me think that Nearly was a better man, because Nearly was in charge, than I had thought. And he said, he isn't. And he also was able to organize getting the supplies to the men quickly, the food they would need, that he has to watch the water tanks. So he was a man of detail, of action, of quick action, and he monitored even when it wasn't his job. The second point I want to bring up is...
Ellen, let me say something really. I think we mentioned it before, but Ben Neely's the guy who tells Dagny, muscles, Miss Taggart, muscles is all it takes to build things in the world. Yeah, he sounds like Popeye, right? Muscles, and he's a materialist. Everything is matter, we're bodies, muscles is all it takes to get things done. Ayn Rand, showing us something here about Marxism, since Marx was a materialist. I thought manual labor was all it took. And you're right, Ellen. Ellis Wyatt is this. He's a representative of the novel's theme. He's the man of the mind. He's understanding all of these things. He realizes, no, it takes a lot more than muscles to build the John Galt line, and effectively, it takes brain power. So, that's the first, foremost, and always. Muscle power is necessary, but it's subsidiary. This is what it takes fundamentally. And Ben Neely is not that guy. McNamara was that guy, which is why John Galt took him out in the first place and left Dagny with Ben Neely. But you're right. Ellis Wyatt's doing the job that McNamara would have done here. That's right. That's what's interesting.
And one of the things that I like, that the thought to action bridge, when he thinks something needs to be done, he moves into action. He doesn't just put it on a to-do list and throw it in the basket. So I want to bring up another point before we move into the Valley, and Shoshana, you may have some things to say too. At the end of the John Galt run, the first run, that same wonderful scene, he was leading Dagny away, and Dagny's got all of the journalists and the cameramen coming after her. Will you give us a message for the public? And Ellis Wyatt points at the long string of freight cars and says, she has. And just that wonderful touch. You don't need all of this blown up, inflated oratory. You just look. That's the whole point of Atlas. Look for yourself, see firsthand, be independent. So Shoshana, if you want to make some comments on that, or move us in.
No, I think that's a lovely example of his wit, and yet it's wit that isn't an empty joke, but it's concise and it's to the point and it's completely correct. And of course, it's a nice bookend for the journalists we had at the scene when the run started. And, we're also Reardon and Dagny were able to give good answers, affirmative answers, concise answers, and witty answers. So it's almost as if he's joined a kind of club of the jolly producers. And for him, it's something new because he's used to being grim. And now, as we said before, he can be fully himself. And I think that that's part of what I love about the character, is that, yes, you know, the grimness and the pushing on, that's himself, but this is himself, you might say, from the inside.
Yeah.
And the inside is coming outside because, well, they've done the work and now
Right.
they can enjoy it.
And
They've
go ahead.
Yeah, I
Oh,
was just going to say that it also reminds me of one of our favorite scenes from The Fountainhead, what I call Miller time comes to the Fountainhead, when Rourke and Dominique and Mallory and Mike, you know, sit around at night on the place where the Stoddard Temple is being built and laugh and enjoy themselves.
so it's a
It's
healthy humor. It's a
yeah,
healthy humor.
healthy humor, and the work is done, you know, and then the work isn't being done by means of humor, but the humor is a kind of, I say, there's a concise, appropriate wittiness to it,
Yeah.
and that's part of Wyatt as well.
And it's putting down evil. It's putting down
Mhm.
phony. Andy, you want to
Yeah.
jump in?
Well, yeah, if I can make a historic and literary integration here that just take us away from Ellis Wyatt for a minute.
And I'll
But
bring us back
yeah,
to
yes, thank you, Will. You always bring me back from my tangents. I appreciate that. But many years after, it was in the 1990s, I think, our good friend Fred Weiss at the Paper Tiger re-released Frank Spearman, or he republished Frank Spearman's novels about the railroad, which is turn of the 20th century novels, reminiscent of one of Ayn Rand's favorite books, Calumet K, you know, about the building of the grain silo. But the thing about Frank Spearman's novels, Whispering Smith is the one title that comes to mind, is these guys, turn of the 20th century American railroad men, I mean, these were can-do guys, and Frank Spearman celebrates them. And Dagny building the John Galt line, you know, years later when I read Spearman's novels, wow. I said, I wonder if Ayn Rand had read Spearman's novels, because, you know, they really show the can-do spirit that Dagny exhibits. You know, that was part of the American ethos, late 19th, turn of the 20th century, with American historians called the Gilded Age. And in the Capitalist Manifesto, I took it upon myself to rechristen it the inventive period. But in real life, this was Edward H. Harriman. This was the Northern Pacific that Spearman based this on. Edward H. Harriman's line, the Harriman built up to you know, to rival James J. Hill's Great Northern. And this the can-do spirit of it is so refreshing. I mean, it's so great to read, and that's who Ayn Rand celebrating. Dagny building the John Galt line, Ellis Wyatt with his innovative method of extracting oil from shale. It's that spirit, you know, that built the United States in the largely in the 19th century, that sadly is under attack today, but certainly lives on in the character of Ellis Wyatt, and you know, and the process of fracking today reminds me of that. You know, it's an innovative way of extracting you know, petroleum products that was, you know, widely used in the United States, and it's very effective. And so, but anyhow, Ellis Wyatt's I think there's the essence of his character, the innovative oil producer, you know, with a innovative method, he revolutionizes the production of petroleum products is really what he does.
So as a way,
Well, Ayn Rand definitely knew Spearman's writings, and when she was in her first residence in California and early years in Hollywood, she made notes for possible adaptations of Spearman books, you know, so she knew them. And then later on, she's ordering some of the books to have, you
Right,
know,
it makes sense.
and she
would
had them in
love,
her library. Yeah,
it would make sense. She would love the can-do spirit of those novels, and can-do
yeah,
regarding productivity. They're not just tough guys fighting bad guys, although that happens too. But they're productive. They're builders. You know, they're creators.
Yes.
I could see. So I recommend. I reviewed Spearman's novels in the 90s for the old Intellectual Activist, and I would recommend them if Fred Weiss at the Paper Tiger is still selling them, or if you can get them from Amazon. Anybody who loves Ayn Rand, I think, will love Frank Spearman's Railroad novels.
So I will thank you, Andy and Shoshana. And I will, unless you want to add something, Shoshana.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I was just looking up, it's in Held for Orders, were, a set of stories. Those were the ones that she was making notes on for possible scenarios.
Yeah.
Okay. Held for Orders by Spearman. Yeah.
That's a collection of short stories, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, they're very good. I remember reading them 20 odd years ago. Some of them are excellent about, again, celebrating productivity, the human capacity, because you're out there in the mountains and the storms and the flooding rivers and everything, and they're building bridges across these flooding rivers. And it's very Ayn Randy. You don't have the philosophy, but you have the glorification of productivity and the American can-do spirit, very much so.
So let's go back to the Valley. And before we get there, I just want to contrast his view about people. Dagny and Reardon are with Ellis in his home for the dinner right after the first run of the John Galt line. And Reardon or Dagny says, "Do you live here alone like this, miles away from everything?" And Wyatt points at the window and says, "I'm a couple of steps away from everything." And they say, "What about people?" He said, "I have guest rooms for the type of people who come to see me on business. I want as many miles as possible between myself and all the other kinds." And then he talks about there being a second Renaissance. Hank, why don't you, now watch the transition though, because he wants the miles away from the people, all of these awful people. And he says, "Hank, why don't you move to Colorado?" That's in the same paragraph. "To hell with New York and the Eastern Seaboard. This is the capital of the Renaissance, the second Renaissance. We had the Stone Age and the Iron Age, and now they're going to call it the Reardon Metal Age." So he's admiring Hank. He said, because there's no limit to what your metal can do. And Hank says that, he's thinking of staying in Philadelphia and buying a lot of land there. Hank says, "I'll give you a race for who's going to be the capital of the Renaissance." So they have this playful banter. And Wyatt says, "Give me an unobstructed right of way and I'll show them how to move the earth." So you get him transitioning. When he's with the people he admires, when he's with the producers and the people who love their life and are passionate about values, he opens up. And that brings us to the Valley. Because when we are in the Valley, we see Ellis's enormous pride. Ellis is building that Buena Esperanza Pass, getting shale out of oil. He's just starting, but he's looking at the place around them with a kind of youthful, again, the child quality, youthful pride and eagerness for acknowledgement. Ellis is wanting acknowledgement. It was the pride of a host at a formal reception in a drawing room, and the eagerness of an artist at the opening of a show in a gallery. Dagny smiled and asked, pointing at the machinery, "Shale oil?" And that's when he makes the comment, that's what he had been planning while he was in hell. He said, "I'm on earth now." And he tells Dagny, she's saying, "You're only getting 1 gallon worth of 1 gallon of oil or something, it's just a small amount of oil he's producing." And he said, "Yes, but it's mine. You need to learn about the word mine." He said, "Have you let them beat you into forgetting what that word means, what it feels like? You should give yourself a chance to relearn it." That egoism comes through. Andy or Shoshana, I don't know if you want to join us in the Valley.
Yeah, well, it's a great conversation because for one thing, you see that he still has the wit and the understanding. And here he's explaining really a deep philosophical point. He explains that she thinks he should be earning a fortune, and he says, "I am. I'm. What's wealth for? It's for expanding one's life, and I'm manufacturing time."
Yes.
And he's improving his methods, and every hour he saves is an hour added to his life. And that it's here, and he invests it, and that's the savings account that he's hoarding. And he even says something clever. He says that I work for use, not for profit. And that's a cliche, right? Production for use. But what, as it's sort of as if somehow these are incompatible. That well, it's a Marxist slogan, production for use, but he means for his use, not the looter's profit. And I think that's very clever. That's almost a Francisco kind of wit, just sort of using the words and applying them to his own meaning. And he taught, you see how very happy he is, and he is not apologizing. He doesn't say, well, down the road I'll do more. No, it's great right now. He's making good use of his time, and he's got more time. Well, what greater wealth is there than owning your time and spending it on growing? So part of what I love about Ellis Wyatt here is that he's both the practical man, the man of action, and he actually is a philosopher here too, and a voice for important ideas. I mean, that's an important way to describe what he's doing. And then he even points at the plant. Okay. And he says, everything must grow. It can't stand still. It must grow or perish. And you know what that is? That's what Ayn Rand said was the one philosophical idea that came to her late in the writing, when she was already in New York, of what she called values for weeds. Okay. That obviously values apply primarily to human beings, but metaphorically, by extension, they can apply to all living things, including weeds. And he points to the plant growing, and he says, they want to grow, not perish, and that's what life is. So Ellis Wyatt is he's a man of action. He's a philosopher. He's a producer. He is a man who is now doing what he wants and not looking over his shoulder back at what he did before.
Yeah.
And not saying, well, when things get adjusted, we'll have a better life. He's happy now. And in the scene that we looked at a few minutes ago, he was happy in Colorado thinking, the age of rearden metal and all the things that we're going to do, unobstructed right of way. Well, it turned out that to really get an unobstructed right of way, he needed to move.
Right.
He needed to move here, but he's happy there. And of course, in the future, when the world learns its lesson, there's going to be a greater scope, but it's his life now, and he's using it the way that he wants.
And he makes one comment, then I'll turn it to you, Andy. He says, here we trade achievements, not failures, values, not needs. This next line, we're free of one another, yet we all grow together. Wealth, Dagny, what greater wealth is there than to own your own life and spend it on growing? That's what you were saying. So Andy, we need to start wrapping up. So do you want to say some final words on
Yeah,
Ellis?
I can just make a couple of last points. When you were speaking just before, Shoshana, reminded me, of a great line from English literature. Right? What matter where if I be still the same? Satan says in Paradise Lost. And which is interesting in itself, since Milton was a devout Protestant, and Satan is virtually the hero of certainly in those opening books, he's virtually the hero of Paradise Lost, and Milton showing us that there's great Satan as this defiant spirit against God's authoritarianism, that great untamed spirit that we were taught, free spirit that we were talking about before with Ellis Wyatt. But bringing that back to the Valley, Ellis Wyatt saying to Dagny, what matter where if I be still the same? Not only am I me here, the same me as I was at a Wyatt Junction, but here I have freedom, whereas out there I don't. And there's the great difference maker. Freedom to like you said, Ellen, my life belongs to me. I own my own life here. So you'd rather be free. Dagny says something like, why she's still attached to the outer world. Why, she was going to construct the rail line. Was it for Francisco's mines? Why build 3 miles, of track and abandon a transcontinental line? Well, Ellis Wyatt giving her an answer here, because here I'm free, and whatever it is, whether it's 3 miles of track or one gallon of oil, whatever, it's mine. And so, I own my own life. That's one point, and the last point I want to make was when you were saying, quoting the line about "Give me a right of way, and I'll show how to move the world." Paraphrasing, of course, Archimedes, the great Greek scientist, inventor, who was a great innovative mind himself, and Ayn Rand honoring that. What was Archimedes' line? Give me a lever and a point upon which to rest it, and I'll move the world. I think that was what I could be misremembering, but anyway, it's a tribute to one of the great innovative minds of of the early days of science in Greek culture.
So, okay, Shoshana, any final words? And then I will wrap it up with.
Well, I think that we've put him in a number of different contexts, and he fits in all of them. And I think it's especially striking in this book that everything about Ellis Wyatt is interesting. I mean, I don't know, but I would guess that people who get bored, which I don't think they ought to, because everything's interesting, but I don't think people skip anything connected with Ellis Wyatt, because it's fresh and it's interesting and it's positive. I mean, the villains within the novel, I confess, I don't always, when I reread the book, I don't always reread everything with the villains, because I know them, and and I've read them the first 20 times. But Ellis Wyatt, he's, it's the adventure of a soul, and he gets, you might say, rescued too. And he was a man who would not have thought of himself as in need of rescue, and he doesn't have the kinds of personal conflicts that Hank Rearden does. But I think, just in the fact that he's so tightly self-controlled, because, well, he has to be. And yet when he's in the valley, he can be both, tightly wound up and happy and exultant. So I love him as a character. Andy just very briefly was mentioning Satan in Paradise Lost, and I'm sure Blake said that Milton was of the devil's party without knowing it, and that's why he gave Satan all the good lines. But if you keep reading in Paradise Lost, Satan has a real mean streak, and he's driven by envy, and he goes after human beings, which is no fair.
So let's come back to Ellis.
Yeah.
Ellis in the valley, this is at Mulligan's house at the dinner. Mulligan says, "Gentlemen, Taggart Transcontinental," and Dagny is greeting everyone face to face. And one of the lines that Ellis has here, he says, or maybe it's a little later, "Dagny, how many years is it going to take you to learn to be yourself?" So the guy at the beginning who's saying, "This is the first time I am myself, Hank," is saying to Dagny, "How many years is it going to take you?" And it was Ellis Wyatt grasping her elbow, leading her to a chair, grinning at her look of helplessness, at the struggle between a smile and the tightening of resistance in her face. And he says to her, "Don't pretend that you don't understand us. You do." And then he said, the reason that Ellis quits, they all go around telling why they quit. Ellis said, "I quit because I didn't wish to serve the cannibal's meal and do the cooking besides. It's the destruction of Colorado that started the growth of this valley. Ellis Wyatt and the others came here to live permanently." Midas says that Ellis came to live there permanently because they had to hide. So I'll end with this. In one of the final scenes in the valley, after Ellis helps rescue John Galt, Ayn Rand talks about all the different homes, and she looks into the home of Francisco d'Anconia, his cabin. And she said, "Francisco lay stretched on the floor by the dancing tongues of a fire," like the Wyatt fire, "bent over sheets of paper, completing the drawing of a smelter. Hank Rearden and Ellis Wyatt sat by the fireplace." This is their dialogue. "John will design the new locomotives," Rearden was saying, "and Dagny will run the first railroad between New York and Philadelphia." And then they hear the music of Haley's Fifth Concerto, and we'll talk about Haley soon. But that Wyatt torch burning at the end, when you see all of the different homes in the valley, and the Wyatt torch can't be put out, it can never be extinguished. So we will say...
Well, Wyatt himself may be able to extinguish it when they come back to the world. So let me make one last point. We got to go back to Paradise Lost, Shoshana, because you're right. Satan devolves into he's the devil, but Atlas Shrugged in a certain way is Paradise Regained, isn't it? And we see the characters evolve if they need to, like Reardon. Some of them don't need to evolve; they just need freedom. But I think Ellis Wyatt's just he just needs freedom, and we know when we go back to the world, when Galt, says the words, "We go back to the world." It's not an accident that Ayn Rand points out Wyatt's torch. It has several levels of meaning here, but in the new world, in Paradise Regained, Ellis Wyatt will be the great oil producer, and maybe he'll be able to extinguish Wyatt's torch. Nobody else can.
So if you look at the premises, he's fine in the category of his view of himself. He's got deep grounded self-esteem, confidence, and it's earned confidence. If you look at his view of people, he's accurately looking out at the world and saying there are a lot of people that can hurt us in the world. And he hasn't met a lot of the Hanks at this point, in the Dagneys, and so he's right to be reticent, to keep an arm's length from them, not reticent, but to keep an arm's length. So his view of people changes dramatically in the novel when he meets the heroes. It doesn't change for the villains. They're still villains. And his view of the world opens up for him dramatically. I'm looking at the premises now. It always was open for him, but he kept it in solitude in Colorado. Now it's open to the world. And the last premise is the premise of his future. The future is now unobstructed. We're going back. So it's just wonderful to just see his character. His premises change in a wonderful direction throughout the novel. So I don't want to say goodbye to Ellis, but we must move on. And his torch will always be burning with the three of us, and Razi, who's here too, and I'm sure all of us who are listening. So,
I guess maybe one last thing, which is that I don't think it took any persuasion to get him to go on strike.
No.
Yeah, just he doesn't have any corrupt premises. He doesn't actually think it's his responsibility to stick to his business under the circumstances, because if he doesn't have an unobstructed right of way, he knows what that means.
Right, correct.
Yeah.
So, okay, we will wrap it up and continue with another character. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you, Dr. Andy Bernstein and Dr. Shoshana Milgram. And I'm Dr. Ellen Kenner, and thank you, Razi.
And
Thanks, everybody. It's been a fun day.
Yeah.